The Supreme Court is poised to issue rulings that could redefine America's relationship with firearms. These cases challenge foundational gun control laws, questioning who can own a gun, what types are allowed, and where they can be carried. The core issue: what are the true limits of the right to keep and bear arms? With nearly every major gun law under scrutiny, the court's decisions will shape public safety, individual liberty, and the nation's legal landscape for generations. As the justices deliberate, the country stands at a pivotal moment in its ongoing debate over guns and constitutional rights. The current wave of gun cases sweeping through American courts is not just a coincidence. It's the direct result of a seismic shift in constitutional law. In recent years, debates over the Second Amendment have intensified, but the roots of today's legal battles can be traced back to a single, pivotal moment. That moment was the Supreme Court's 2022 Bruen decision, a ruling that fundamentally altered how courts evaluate gun regulations. Before Bruen, judges weighed the government's interest in public safety against individual rights, using a balancing test that allowed for some flexibility and nuance. But Bruen swept that approach aside. The court declared that from now on, any gun law must be consistent with the history and tradition of firearm regulation in America. In other words, if a similar law didn't exist in the late 1700s or 1800s, it's now on shaky ground. This new standard has sent shockwaves through the legal system. Lawyers and judges are now tasked with digging deep into centuries-old statutes, searching for historical analogs to justify or challenge modern gun laws. The process is painstaking, often involving expert testimony from historians and legal scholars, and has led to a surge in litigation nationwide. The result? A patchwork of conflicting rulings. In some states, courts have struck down long-standing gun restrictions, while others have upheld them, leading to confusion and legal chaos. Americans are now living under dramatically different gun laws depending on where they reside, and the uncertainty is fueling even more lawsuits. With over 60 Second Amendment petitions currently awaiting review, the Supreme Court faces mounting pressure to step in and provide clarity. The justices must now decide how strictly the Bruen test should be applied, and whether any exceptions or modern considerations can be taken into account. The decisions they make in the coming months and years will not only resolve today's disputes, but will also set the boundaries for gun control and gun rights for generations to come. The legal landscape is being redrawn in real time, with every ruling shaping the future. As the nation watches, the stakes could not be higher. The outcome will impact not just the right to bear arms, but also the safety of communities, the authority of lawmakers, and the very meaning of constitutional rights in modern America. This term, the Supreme Court is poised to take on a series of cases that could fundamentally alter the landscape of gun rights and regulations in the United States. The justices are set to address some of the most contentious and closely watched legal battles in recent memory, with the potential to impact millions of Americans and shape the nation's approach to firearms for years to come. Among the headline cases is a challenge that could reshape American gun laws as we know them, testing the boundaries of the Second Amendment and the government's authority to regulate firearms. In United States v. Himani, the court will decide whether the long-standing federal ban on gun ownership for individuals who use illegal drugs is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. This case not only questions the reach of federal power, but also asks how modern laws should be interpreted in light of the Supreme Court's recent decisions expanding gun rights. Another major case, Wolford v. Lopez, challenges Hawaii's strict law that limits the ability to carry concealed firearms in public spaces. At the heart of this dispute is the delicate balance between an individual's right to bear arms and the rights of private property owners, as well as the state's responsibility to ensure public safety. The outcome could set a precedent for how far states can go in regulating where and how guns are carried. The court is also considering whether to take up a series of challenges to state bans on popular semi-automatic rifles and high-capacity magazines. These cases have sparked intense debate across the country, as they touch on the types of firearms and accessories that are commonly owned by law-abiding citizens, as well as the government's ability to restrict access to weapons that have been used in mass shootings. The decisions here could affect not only gun owners, but also law enforcement, manufacturers, and communities nationwide. With lower courts issuing conflicting rulings on these critical issues, the Supreme Court's intervention is expected to bring much-needed clarity and establish national standards. the justices' decisions will likely resolve legal uncertainty and guide lawmakers, judges, and citizens alike on what is and isn't permissible under the Constitution. These high-profile cases will determine the future of public carry laws, the legality of assault weapon bans, and the limits on magazine capacities. The rulings could either expand or restrict the rights of gun owners, and will almost certainly influence the ongoing national debate over gun violence and public safety. The outcomes could either reinforce or dismantle key pillars of gun regulation, sending ripple effects through state legislatures, advocacy groups, and communities across the country. Lawmakers and activists on both sides are watching closely, knowing that the court's decisions could redefine the boundaries of the Second Amendment for a generation. As the justices prepare to hear arguments and issue rulings, all eyes are on the Supreme Court. The nation awaits answers to questions that will shape the future of gun rights, public safety, and constitutional law in America. The federal law banning felons from owning firearms is under intense Supreme Court scrutiny. Critics argue the lifetime ban is too broad, failing to distinguish between violent and non-violent offenders. The Department of Justice defends the law as essential for public safety but offers an administrative process for non-violent felons to restore their rights. With dozens of petitions before the court, the justices must decide whether to uphold, strike down, or modify this foundational law. Their ruling will impact millions and set a precedent for how criminal history affects constitutional rights. Assault weapon and high-capacity magazine bans are now at the center of the Supreme Court's attention. Supporters say these laws save lives by limiting access to military-style firearms and reducing mass shooting casualties. Opponents argue these bans target common, widely owned firearms and infringe on the Second Amendment. The key question: does the Bruin history and tradition test allow for banning entire classes of popular weapons? With challenges pending from states like California and Illinois, the court's decision could upend gun regulations nationwide. The outcome will redefine what firearms Americans can legally own. The Supreme Court is also weighing whether age-based gun restrictions violate the rights of young adults. Laws barring 18 to 20-year-olds from buying certain firearms are under challenge, with critics calling them discriminatory. The court must decide if there's historical precedent for disarming young adults considered part of the militia. Meanwhile, new state laws restricting firearm advertising to minors have sparked First Amendment battles, with groups like the NRA limiting youth outreach and protest. These cases pit gun rights against free speech, raising complex constitutional questions. The court's rulings could reshape both Second and First Amendment protections for a new generation. The Department of Justice is fighting to defend federal gun laws under the new Bruin standard. Their argument: modern regulations should be allowed if they reflect the principles behind historical restrictions, even if the specifics differ. In cases like Himani and the felon in possession ban, the DOJ points to historical practices of disarming those deemed dangerous or lawless. For assault weapons, they cite the tradition of regulating dangerous and unusual arms. The DOJ is also offering administrative remedies like restoring rights for nonviolent felons to avoid sweeping court decisions. This dual strategy aims to preserve gun regulations while adapting to the court's new legal framework. Legal experts warn that the Bruin history and tradition test is fraught with ambiguity, leaving courts and lawmakers with more questions than answers. The test, which requires judges to look back into the past to determine the constitutionality of modern gun laws, has sparked intense debate in legal circles. Many scholars argue that history is rarely clear-cut, and that the traditions of centuries ago can be difficult to interpret or apply to today's vastly different society. The challenge is not just academic, it has real-world consequences for how laws are written, enforced, and challenged in court. Judges must now act as historians, sifting through layers of legal precedent and historical context, comparing modern laws to centuries-old statutes and customs. This process is often complicated by the fact that historical records can be incomplete, contradictory, or open to interpretation. As a result, different judges may reach very different conclusions when faced with similar cases, leading to a patchwork of rulings across the country. The burden on the judiciary is immense, as they are asked to balance respect for tradition with the realities of contemporary life. The Supreme Court's real challenge is to clarify how lower courts should interpret history. Should judges focus on the founding era, the Reconstruction period, or some other point in time? What sources are reliable? And how should conflicting historical evidence be weighed? These questions are at the heart of the current legal debate, and the answers will shape the future of gun regulation in America. Another key issue is how close the analogy must be between a modern law and its historical counterpart. Is a general similarity enough, or must there be a nearly identical law from the past? The answer could determine the fate of countless regulations, from background checks to restrictions on certain types of firearms. The stakes are high, and the potential for controversy is enormous. Too broad a ruling risks a public backlash and could undermine the legitimacy of the court. On the other hand, a decision that is too narrow may alienate gun rights advocates and leave unresolved questions for years to come. The nation is watching closely, as lawmakers, activists, and ordinary citizens await guidance on one of the most contentious issues in American life. Experts predict that, at least in the near term, the justices will issue narrow, case-specific rulings designed to provide some guidance without making sweeping changes. These decisions will serve as signposts for lower courts, helping them navigate the complex intersection of history, tradition, and modern law. Ultimately, the court's decisions will determine whether the new standard brings much-needed clarity to gun law, or whether it plunges the legal system into further confusion and chaos. The ripple effects will be felt not just in the courts, but in legislatures, police departments, and communities across the country. The stakes are enormous for both the legal system and American society. As the nation grapples with questions of safety, rights, and tradition, the path forward remains uncertain, and the decisions made in the coming months will shape the future for generations to come. America stands at a crossroads as the Supreme Court prepares to decide the future of gun rights and regulation. These rulings will affect who can own a gun, what firearms are legal, and how states can regulate them, impacting millions of lives. The outcomes will shape public safety, civil liberties, and the nation's political landscape for years to come. Now is the time for every citizen to get informed and engaged in this historic debate. Follow our coverage, join the conversation, and make your voice heard. The future of the Second Amendment is being written now. Be part of the story.